John had been on a work trip for the last 4 days, and although the time away from home had provided a much-needed break from the daily grind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he missed his wife, Emma. Their relationship, like any other, had its ups and downs, but in the quiet moments of his hotel room at night, he found himself longing for the small, everyday moments they shared. The warm cups of coffee in the mornings, the way she laughed when she watched her favorite TV shows, the quiet way she'd kiss him goodnight. He'd spoken to her every evening on the phone, and although their conversations were filled with the usual pleasantries, how work was going, how the weather was back home, it felt distant. It wasn't like their normal chats where they'd discuss their plans for the weekend or joke about things that had happened during their day. There was an unspoken distance that seemed to have crept in over the past few months. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but John could feel it. Maybe it was the long hours Emma had been working, or the fact that they hadn't had a real vacation together in over a year. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, even if it wasn't something he could put his finger on. The evening before he was scheduled to fly home, John sat in his hotel room, scrolling through his emails, mentally preparing himself for the long flight the next day. His original plan had been to arrive home in the evening, just in time for dinner. He'd already spoken to Emma earlier that day, and she had seemed happy to hear from him, though she'd sounded tired. She told him she'd be working late and would likely just order in some food for herself. He wasn't too concerned. After all, they both had busy lives, and it wasn't unusual for them to spend evenings apart when work called. But then, as he sat there thinking about her, John decided he wanted to surprise her. He didn't know why, but the idea of surprising Emma, of showing up unannounced to remind her how much he missed her, seemed like a perfect way to bring some excitement back into their routine. Maybe it was his longing for connection. Maybe it was the fact that their relationship had been feeling a little stale. Either way, he felt an overwhelming desire to do something spontaneous, something she wouldn't expect. He quickly checked his flight details. There was an earlier flight out of the city, one that would get him home in the early afternoon instead of the evening. He'd arrive before she even had the chance to make her usual dinner plans. John booked the flight and packed his bags in a hurry, barely taking the time to go through everything, tossing his clothes and toiletries into his suitcase with the excitement of someone who was eager to get home. He wanted to see her face when he walked through the door, wanted to see that look of surprise mixed with relief and happiness. It had been a while since they'd shared a moment like that, and the thought of it filled him with a strange sense of joy. The flight was smooth, and the anticipation of the surprise made the hours pass quickly. By the time he landed, John was practically buzzing with excitement. He grabbed his bag, hailed a cab, and gave the driver the address to their home. As the cab drove through the familiar streets, John felt a growing sense of excitement mixed with nerves. He hadn't even thought about how to break the news to Emma once he got home. Would she be happy? Would she be surprised? Or would she be annoyed that he'd interrupted her plans? He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The taxi pulled up in front of their house, a small, cozy place they had bought together 5 years ago. It was the house they'd both dreamed of, a home they could start their life in, and a place that held all the memories of their time together. It was a 2-story house, the kind with a picket fence and a garden out front that Emma had taken great pride in cultivating. There was a sense of comfort in this house, a warmth that John had always associated with his marriage to Emma. He paid the driver and stepped out of the cab, glancing around the quiet neighborhood. It was around noon, and the streets were still. He walked to the front door, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he stopped. Something felt off. It wasn't that he had any specific reason to be concerned, but the weight of the silence was unnerving. The house looked the same from the outside, but something about it seemed quieter than usual. John tried to shake off the feeling, convincing himself that he was just being paranoid. After all, Emma had probably just gotten caught up in work, or maybe she had gone out for a bit. He couldn't expect everything to be perfect. John quietly unlocked the front door and stepped inside. He immediately noticed the silence. Normally, the house was filled with the sounds of Emma's footsteps, the hum of the television in the background, or the gentle sound of the dishwasher running. But today there was nothing. The house felt eerily still, like something was missing. "Emma?" he called out, but his voice echoed in the emptiness. He frowned. It was unusual for her not to be around. She didn't have any appointments, and she'd mentioned she was working from home today. He took off his shoes and hung up his coat, moving through the hallway toward the kitchen. The kitchen was empty, but the coffee maker was on, a half-filled cup of coffee sitting on the counter. The sight of it made him pause. He could tell that someone had been here recently, but there were no signs of Emma. He checked the living room, the bedroom, even the bathroom, but there was no sign of her anywhere. John's heart started to race. He thought back to the conversation they had had earlier. She had told him she'd be working late, which meant she could have been in the middle of something when he arrived home. But it was already past noon. She should have been here by now, or at least there should have been some sign of where she had gone. He picked up his phone, feeling a slight unease. There were no missed calls from her, but there was a new text message. It was from Emma, sent last night. She had written, "I'm meeting with someone today. I'll be home late." He felt a knot form in his stomach as he reread the message. Meeting with someone? It wasn't like Emma to keep things like that from him. She usually told him if she was going out or meeting up with friends, but this time there was no mention of who she was meeting. His mind began to race. Was it just a colleague? Or was there something more to this? John tried to shake off the thoughts and check the time. She still had a few hours before she'd be home, but for some reason, the silence was getting to him. He felt the weight of the empty house pressing in on him, the sense that something wasn't right. As he stood in the living room, he heard the sound of the front door opening. John froze. He wasn't expecting Emma, not yet. He listened closely. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. It wasn't the sound of someone who was rushing to get inside. And then the door clicked shut behind the person. He stood motionless for a moment before walking toward the door. Maybe she had just been outside. Maybe she had stepped out for a walk. But as he peered through the doorway, the sight of a man standing in the hallway froze him in his tracks. The man looked just as surprised to see John standing there. He was tall, with dark hair, and he was holding a coffee cup in his hand. His expression was one of confusion, as though he had walked into an unexpected situation. John's heart pounded in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice coming out in a mix of confusion and disbelief. The man, still holding the coffee cup, hesitated before answering. Ben. I was just talking with Emma. She should be back soon." John stared at him, his mind spinning. Who was this? Why hadn't Emma mentioned him? There was no explanation, no warning. Nothing. The sense of unease deepened as John's eyes locked onto the stranger in his hallway. What was going on? Before John could respond, he heard the sound of the front door opening again. This time, it was Emma who walked in. She froze when she saw John standing there, her face going pale as she quickly processed the scene unfolding in front of her. She glanced nervously between John and Ben before her eyes met John's. "John," she began, her voice faltering. "I didn't expect you back today." John's chest tightened, the confusion in his mind slowly giving way to something else. A feeling of betrayal, something that felt as cold and final as the air in the room. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I came home early," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "I wanted to surprise you." But it was he who had been surprised. John stood frozen in the hallway, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. His heart raced, and for a moment, he felt as though the world around him had tilted, as though the very foundation of his reality had shifted in an instant. He glanced between the man, Ben, and Emma, trying to piece together the situation, but his mind was spinning too quickly. The shock was overwhelming, and his thoughts kept racing back to the text message Emma had sent him the night before. "I'm meeting with someone today." But this was not just anyone. This was a stranger standing in their hallway. The way he was holding his coffee cup and the casualness of his demeanor only added to John's sense of confusion. Emma's eyes darted between John and Ben, her expression filled with guilt, but there was also fear there. She was visibly caught off guard, unable to formulate the right words as she stared John. Her usual composure seemed to have evaporated, leaving her looking small and vulnerable in a way John had never seen before. "John," she started again, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't expect you home so early." There was a moment of silence, the kind of silence that felt thick with unspoken words, each second stretching into infinity. John opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was dry. His brain was working too fast, trying to make sense of what was going on, but nothing fit. Nothing about this made sense. Ben's casual presence in his house, Emma's nervous demeanor, it all felt like a punch to the gut. The very thing he had hoped to avoid, feeling like an outsider in his own home, was happening right in front of him. I didn't know you'd be home early, Emma continued, her words coming out in a rush, as if she were trying to explain something she wasn't sure how to explain. I wasn't expecting you until later. John swallowed hard. His emotions were a mix of frustration and confusion, but there was something else, something more primal, bubbling up inside him, a deep, gnawing suspicion, a feeling of betrayal. Who is this? He managed to ask, his voice tight, though it still managed to convey the underlying tension. And why is he here? Emma's gaze flickered toward Ben for a brief moment before she turned back to John. Ben's a friend, she said, her voice unsteady, her words falling flat in the silence. We were talking, just talking. John didn't know why, but the word just talking didn't sit right with him. They felt too rehearsed, too practiced. He could tell by the way she avoided his gaze that there was more to this explanation than she was willing to share. His eyes moved from Emma to Ben, trying to read him, but the man's face was unreadable, as if he were waiting for some cue from Emma, some direction. John's gaze lingered on Ben's face, studying the faint lines around his eyes, the casual stance, the way he held the coffee cup like he belonged there. And then the sudden realization hit him, a cold weight settling in his chest. Ben wasn't just a random person. He was someone Emma trusted, someone she had let into their home, into their private space. That thought alone made John's stomach churn. Talking? John repeated, his voice rising slightly. Just talking? That's all this is? Emma winced at his tone, but she didn't respond immediately. Ben, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them. The silence stretched on, and John could feel the tension in the room thickening with every passing second. There was no easy way to navigate this situation. He knew that, but his mind was too clouded with confusion and hurt to process anything calmly. I think I should go, Ben said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but John heard the underlying hesitation. He glanced at Emma, who gave him a quick, almost imperceptible nod. Ben gave John one last look, then turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow, deliberate. When he reached the threshold, he hesitated for a moment, as though waiting for something, an apology, a question, a sign of some kind, but John said nothing. Ben stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. John's eyes were still fixed on the door long after Ben had left. It wasn't just the man's presence that unsettled him. It was the situation itself. Emma had been keeping something from him. That much was clear now. Whether it was a harmless friendship or something deeper, John couldn't say, but he knew something wasn't right, and it was killing him inside. Emma, John said, his voice low, almost too quiet. He turned to face her, his heart still pounding, the adrenaline of the moment starting to give way to something more painful, disappointment. What's going on? Why didn't you tell me about him? And what is this? Why did he have to be here when I got home? Emma stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a nervous energy radiating from her. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but then she closed it again. She took a step forward, but her movements were stiff, like she wasn't entirely sure how to approach him. Her eyes were wide, filled with emotion, guilt, regret, fear. I didn't mean for this to happen, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could handle it. John's brow furrowed, and his jaw clenched. Tell me what, Emma? He was trying to stay calm, trying to piece the words together, but everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He couldn't make sense of what she was saying, or more importantly, what she wasn't saying. What are you trying to handle? What's going on between you two? Emma looked away from him, her gaze shifting to the floor. She shook her head, as though she were struggling to find the right words, or maybe the courage to say what needed to be said. John's heart ached as he watched her, feeling that same, familiar sense of disconnect that had been growing between them. The distance between them had never felt so wide. "I'm sorry, John," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "I should have told you. I didn't want to hurt you, but I've been struggling for a while now. With us. With everything." John's mind raced. Struggling? With them? He tried to process what she was saying, but the words didn't make sense. She had been distant lately, but hadn't they both been? They had both been busy, distracted by their careers and responsibilities. But this was different. Struggling? John repeated, his voice rough. "Emma, what are you talking about? You're telling me that you've been seeing this guy, and now you're just telling me?" "No," she interrupted quickly, her voice rising in panic. "No, it's not like that. It wasn't like I went looking for someone else. I never wanted that. But we've been growing apart, John. You've been away so much with work, and I've been caught up in my own stuff. And then, Ben and I just started talking. We were just friends at first, but then things got complicated. I didn't want to go any further, but I didn't know how to stop it either." John's chest tightened as she spoke, and his thoughts spun out of control. He felt betrayed, but also confused. He couldn't tell if what she was saying was the whole truth or just part of it. He didn't know if he could trust her words anymore. The idea of her having developed any kind of emotional connection with another man, someone she had brought into their home, no less, cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. "You were talking to him like this while I was away?" John asked, his voice hoarse. "You let this happen, Emma? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me instead of keeping this all a secret?" "I didn't want to hurt you," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could fix things on my own, but I was wrong. I should have told you earlier." John shook his head, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. Part of him wanted to believe her, to believe that it was all just a misunderstanding, a misstep in a relationship that had hit a rough patch. But another part of him, the part that was still reeling from the shock, wanted to walk out the door and never look back. He turned away from her, running his hands through his hair, trying to steady himself. His thoughts were fragmented, scattered. "I need time, Emma," he said, his voice tinged with pain. "I need time to think." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, John saw the woman he had once known, the woman he had married, the woman he had promised to stand by. But even as that image flashed before him, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest. He needed space, time to figure out what he was feeling, what this meant for them. "I'm so sorry," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. John didn't respond. He couldn't. The silence that followed felt suffocating, a reflection of everything that had gone wrong. With a final glance at Emma, he walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, the weight of their shared history heavy in the air between them. The days following the confrontation were a blur. John didn't know how to navigate through the storm of emotions that had swept through his life. He had spent the first night at the house, pacing back and forth, trying to wrap his head around everything that had unfolded. Emma had been quiet, keeping her distance, giving him space to process. But the silence between them had become unbearable. It was as if their words had become a battleground, and neither of them was ready to pick up the pieces. The next morning, John had made the decision to leave. Not permanently, but he needed time away. He needed to clear his head, and the house, with all its memories, felt like a cage. So, he packed a bag and left, telling Emma he was going to stay at a friend's place for a few days. He didn't want to stay in their home and continue to exist in this tension-filled bubble. He needed room to breathe. The first few days were filled with a strange sense of numbness. John had reached out to a few of his close friends, trying to avoid the constant reminder of what had happened at home. It was a delicate balance between not wanting to talk about the situation and yet needing to talk about it, needing to make sense of what had transpired. But whenever he tried, the words felt wrong, like he was telling a story that wasn't truly his. He had asked one of his friends, Matt, for advice. But Matt, though understanding, hadn't had much to offer. He had asked John to think about what he really wanted, to look at the situation from all angles. John tried. He did. But the question he kept coming back to was, why didn't Emma trust me? Why hadn't she come to him with her concerns earlier? Why had she let it go on for so long? The man, Ben, had been in their home, drinking coffee, talking to her like a close friend. John couldn't shake the image of him standing there, so at ease, while the husband, had been on the outside looking in. It had cut deeper than the betrayal itself. It was the secrecy, the idea that she had allowed something to grow in the shadows, not just between her and another person, but between her and him. Over the next few days, John started avoiding her calls. He didn't know what to say to her. Emma had tried reaching out multiple times, but each time, he ignored her texts, left her messages unanswered. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to her, but every conversation seemed impossible, like walking through quicksand. It was like they were speaking two different languages, unable to meet in the middle. He stayed with Matt for a few nights, but he could barely focus on anything. The tension from the situation seeped into every part of his life, and even in the company of his friends, he felt utterly alone. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world had been turned upside down, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, it was always there, lurking in the background of his every thought. On the fourth day, he had received a message from Emma that broke through the fog of his isolation. It was a short, simple text. "Can we talk? I think we need to talk." For the first time in days, something in her message broke through the wall he had been building around himself. He didn't know if he was ready for the conversation, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. He had to face it. He had to face her. So, he agreed to meet her at a cafe they used to go to on weekends. It was a neutral place, a space where they could sit together without the weight of their home looming over them. John arrived first, walking into the small coffee shop, the familiar smell of roasted beans filling the air. The place hadn't changed since their last visit. The same mismatched chairs, the same framed artwork on the walls. It was a place that held memories, but today it felt foreign, distant. He sat at a small table by the window, staring out at the street. People walked by, going about their day, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside him. His mind raced. He had no idea how this conversation would unfold. He didn't even know what he wanted to say to her. But one thing was clear, something had shifted between them. It was no longer just about trust. It was about the very foundation of their relationship. When Emma walked into the cafe, John stood up, his eyes locking with hers. She looked the same, but there was something different in the way she carried herself. She wasn't the confident, strong woman he had known. There was a vulnerability in her now that seemed almost out of place. She walked over to the table slowly, as if unsure of what kind of reception she would receive. "Hey," she said softly, taking a seat across from him. Her voice was tentative, as if she were testing the waters, unsure of how to proceed. "Hey," John replied, his voice hoarse. He tried to smile, but it didn't come naturally. There was too much distance between them now, too much that had been left unsaid. They both sat there for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. The clink of cups and soft hum of conversation from nearby tables filled the space around them, but it did little to ease the tension. John shifted in his seat, trying to figure out how to start. Emma broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot, John, about everything that happened, and I know I messed up. I should have told you earlier. I should have been honest with you, but I didn't know how." Her eyes were downcast, avoiding his gaze. She fiddled with the napkin in front of her, wringing it between her fingers. John swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell me, Emma? Why did you let it go on for so long?" "I don't know," she said quietly. "I guess I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just talked to him, it would be fine. I didn't think it would go anywhere. But then, I started relying on him for things I should have been telling you. It just happened, and by the time I realized it, I was already in too deep." John clenched his fists under the table. "In too deep? What does that even mean? Did you care about him more than you care about me?" Emma flinched at his words, her face contorting in a mixture of pain and guilt. No, it wasn't like that. I swear, John, I never wanted anything more than what we had. But I was lonely. I missed you, and I guess I thought talking to him was easier than confronting what was going wrong between us." John shook his head slowly, trying to process her words. "Lonely? Emma, we were living together. We were married. You could have come to me, but instead you let this, whatever this was, go on behind my back. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. I should have been honest. I should have come to you, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to fix it. John's chest tightened as he looked at her. He could see the regret in her eyes, the rawness of her apology, but it wasn't enough. The damage had been done. He didn't know if he could trust her again. The thought of her confiding in someone else, someone who wasn't him, hurt more than he had expected. It wasn't just the idea of betrayal. It was the fact that she had chosen to isolate herself instead of working through their issues together. It had all felt so sudden, so sharp, and it left him questioning everything about their relationship. I don't know what to do with all of this, Emma, John said, his voice breaking slightly. I need time. I need space to think. I can't just pretend like nothing happened. I need to understand what this means for us. I understand, she said softly, her voice filled with sadness. Take whatever time you need. I'll give you the space you want. But please know that I'm sorry. And I want to make this right. I want to fix it. John nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He didn't know if they could fix it. He didn't know if he even wanted to anymore. The idea of rebuilding trust, of healing what had been broken, felt like an impossible task. They sat in silence for a while, neither knowing what to say next. Outside, the world continued to move forward, but for John and Emma, time seemed to have frozen. The world felt divided into two parts, before and after the moment they had crossed this painful line. And in the quiet of the cafe, both of them understood that the path ahead would never be the same. Eventually, Emma stood up, her eyes meeting his one last time. I'll leave you to think, she said, her voice soft but firm. John nodded again, his heart heavy. As she turned and walked toward the door, he felt the distance between them grow even wider. Each step she took was a reminder that things would never be the same. And as she disappeared out of the cafe, John was left alone with his thoughts, unsure of what to do next or how to move forward. All he knew was that the silence between them was no longer just a space. It was a chasm, and it seemed insurmountable. The days following that fateful meeting at the cafe were a blur, each one bleeding into the next. John felt trapped in a haze, unable to focus on anything for long. Every time he tried to distract himself with work, or even with his friends, his mind wandered back to Emma. The weight of what had transpired between them was always there, hanging over him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The image of Emma's tear-streaked face, her words full of regret, replayed in his mind over and over, and the more he thought about it, the more questions seemed to arise. Why had she waited so long to tell him the truth? Was she truly remorseful, or was she simply sorry that she had been caught? It hurt to think about it, but the uncertainty was worse. The more time he spent away from her, the more he started to question their relationship. Could trust ever be rebuilt? Could they return to the life they once had? Or had everything been permanently shattered? A week had passed since their meeting, and while the pain of the situation hadn't faded, it had started to settle into something more manageable, a dull ache, a constant companion in his thoughts. He hadn't spoken to Emma since that day. She had respected his space, though he had heard from her a few times in texts. Short, tentative messages asking how he was doing, whether he was ready to talk, or if he needed anything. But John didn't respond. He was still too raw, still too confused to find the right words. Every time he picked up his phone, his thumb hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to press send. The silence felt easier than anything else. It wasn't until the weekend, when he was sitting in his small apartment, that he felt the weight of indecision pressing down on him. John had spent most of the day walking aimlessly around the city, lost in his thoughts. He had walked along the river, watched the boats drift by, listened to the sounds of the city that once felt so familiar. But today they felt foreign. He had grown used to the emptiness of his apartment. But the loneliness, the silence, was starting to suffocate him. He needed to make a decision. He couldn't keep avoiding Emma forever. He couldn't keep hiding from the reality of what had happened. His heart and his mind were at war with each other. His heart wanted to forgive her, wanted to believe that they could find their way back to what they once had. But his mind kept telling him that things would never be the same again. There would always be a crack in their relationship, a fissure that couldn't be repaired. John knew that the only way to move forward, whether they stayed together or not, was to make a choice. And he had to face the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. It was then that he received a message from Emma. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I understand that you need space, but I think it's time we talk. I'm ready to listen, and I'm ready to try to make things right. Please, let's meet." He stared at the message for a long time, his finger hovering over the screen. The decision had been made for him. He had to meet her. It was time to face the truth, time to confront the pain. It wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. They agreed to meet at the same cafe where they had last spoken. John arrived first, as he had that day, and once again he sat by the window. The familiar hum of the cafe surrounded him, but it couldn't mask the churning in his stomach. Every minute felt like an eternity, and when he finally saw her walk in, he felt his chest tighten. She looked the same, but there was something different about her. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes tired. She had been carrying this burden, too. Emma walked over to him and sat down across the table. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze filled with sadness, regret, and hope. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," she said quietly, her voice soft. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve another chance, but I want to try, John. I love you, and I've been selfish, but I want to make it right. I don't want to lose you." John took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. There it was, the one question he had been avoiding. Could he forgive her? Could he let go of the anger, the hurt, and the fear that had been festering inside him for so long? The question was bigger than just their relationship. It was about trust, about vulnerability, about the kind of future they could build together, or if they could build one at all. "I don't know, Emma," he said, his voice shaky. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I just don't know if I can ever trust you the same way again. I can't unsee what I saw. I can't unhear what you said. I've never felt so betrayed, and I don't know if I can move past it." Tears filled Emma's eyes as she looked at him, her breath coming in shaky sobs. "I understand," she whispered. "I understand if you can't, but I'll fight for you, for us, if you'll let me. I'll do whatever it takes. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to prove I can make it right." John was silent for a long time, lost in thought. His heart ached as he watched her. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but he also couldn't ignore the fear in his chest. He couldn't ignore the lingering doubt, the uncertainty that this was even possible. Could he trust her again? Was love enough to fix the fractures that had appeared in their relationship? Was he strong enough to rebuild what had been broken? The silence stretched on, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then, in the stillness, he realized something. He wasn't sure if forgiveness was the right choice, or if they could ever go back to the way things were. But what he did know, what had become clear over the past week, was that he wasn't ready to let go of their love. He wasn't ready to walk away from the life they had built together, even if it meant taking a leap into the unknown. "I don't know how this will work," John finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try, Emma. I'm willing to try if you are. But it won't be easy. We'll have to rebuild trust from the ground up. It will take time, and there will be moments when it feels impossible. But if we both want it, if we both work at it, maybe we can find our way back." Emma's face lit up with hope, and she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'll do whatever it takes, John. I'll be patient, I'll be honest, and I'll work every day to show you that I can be the woman you deserve. I won't give up on us." John looked at her, his heart torn between the fear of the unknown and the glimmer of hope that had begun to grow inside him. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know where this path would lead, but in that moment, they both understood that this was their choice. They could either walk away from each other, allowing the distance to grow until it was insurmountable, or they could face the future together, hand in hand, and rebuild what had been broken. The choice was hard, but it was theirs to make. John squeezed her hand, the smallest of smiles tugging at his lips. "Let's take it one day at a time," he said quietly. Emma nodded, tears still glistening in her eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of hope. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, they both felt like maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and heartache, but it would also be filled with the possibility of healing, of growth, and of rediscovering the love they had almost lost. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were willing to try. And for the first time in a long while, John felt a flicker of hope. A hope that, with time and effort, they could rebuild together. And maybe, just maybe, they could find their way home again.